Thus, man's crowning dignity, a shining silk hat.
Hello, subscribers, viewers, friends, enemies. Man's crowning dignity. Top hat. Marvelous. I love top hats. The one that I wear is an antique. It was very likely made in the 1800s. It's not in the best condition. There's some creases and the stitching is basically disintegrated. But it's covered in this silk plush, the shiny bits.
It's a very special silk, whose secret is unknown outside Lyon in France.
Silk plush is a wonderful material. Though the unfortunate fact is, it's not made anymore. Production of silk plush stopped in the 1960s. But what is plush? What is hatter's plush, silk plush, whatever you may call it? Well, you can see it is rather similar to velvet, though the fibers are longer and they all face in one direction. It's called the nap. There's a variety of stories as to why silk plush is no longer produced. It usually involves a factory in France, the only one that produced silk plush, because of course it's in France. Where else would it be? And it's owned by two brothers, usually. And in one variation of the story, the brothers had a falling out, and one of the brothers burned down the factory with all the looms inside it. And so from then on, the world was deprived of silk plush. It will never be made again, though there are some modern alternatives. There are hats made out of a similar material to silk plush called melazine. It isn't silk, it's rabbit fur. Specifically, the longest hairs of the rabbit fur are taken and spun into a material that mimics the nap of the silk plush. Now, it's certainly shiny, though it does not possess the deep, rich blackness that silk does. Yet another alternative for the silk top hat is the felt top hat. It can be made out of many types of felt. Wool felt, fur felt, beaver felt. Beaver felt, oh dear. I'll get into that later. You probably won't find many beaver felt hats made new nowadays. In fact, I don't think you'll find any. So vintage is where to go with that one. I don't recommend buying beaver felt top hats, especially the older ones. A little bit toxic. Now, felt top hats, such as wool, fur, beaver felt, they're not shiny, of course. They usually will not be as elegant, but they'll still be perfectly acceptable for dress codes such as morning wear and for events such as Royal Ascot, which, for men, a top hat is required. Not that I'm a man, of course, and not that I ever will be. Now, probably the least elegant alternative is a cheap, costumey top hat. I've just gotten rid of my costume top hat. In fact, I gave it back to the original owner, so I do not have one handy to show you. So I'm going to use some footage that I filmed a few days ago where I still had the hat. I don't like it. You can buy very costumey, inauthentic top hats. Really, they're not very good. Probably more durable than any of the other top hats. But that's not why you buy a top hat. This one is very strange. It's not paired with my silk hat. It's rather short for some reason. It has very strange brim curl. It's not shiny, which it doesn't need to be. But the hat band is shiny. And it's not even a very elegant shape. It is just sort of a cone. The crown is smaller at the top than it is at the bottom. If you take yourself seriously, do not buy one of these. Unless it is, of course, for a costume. And even then, don't buy something like this. This is not. I would hesitate to even call this a top hat. But how did this all come to be? Where did top hats come from? Well, I'm glad you asked. Or, if you didn't, that's okay too. I'm not a historian, so take everything that I say with a grain of salt. In fact, quite a few grains of salt. I'm just sharing what I've heard, and what, in my unprofessional opinion, is the most plausible. So theory is that top hats came from the sort of cone-shaped pilgrim hat, popular in Europe and the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries, so that would be the 1500s to the 1600s, we'll say. I don't know. I'm sure you're thinking of it. It has a brim, it's black, it's sort of a cone shape, has a sort of flat top, and you might see, instead of a hat band, you might see a buckle, for whatever reason. I certainly don't know. Now, eventually, over time, they evolved to have the shape that you see here, where it's mostly a cylinder, but, you know, fitted to your head shape, with a brim, and not an exact cylinder because it flares in and then out again in the crown. Now those hats were made of beaver felt usually, which was rather unethical. Beavers were hunted to near extinction in North America just for hats. Just for top hats, beavers went nearly extinct. To add on to this, have you ever heard of the Mad Hatter? I'm sure you have. Well, the story of the Mad Hatter, in fact the legend, the myth, whatever you may call it, comes from real-life hatters who would make top hats out of beaver felt. Now, beaver fur felt top hats would be stiffened using mercury, so not great. Mercury, I'm sure you know, is an incredibly toxic substance, especially to your brain. You know, the part that you kind of need to stay alive. So because of exposure to the mercury that they used to stiffen hats, the hatters would go mad! They would go insane. That's where the legend of the Mad Hatter comes from. Now, eventually, in the early 1800s, silk plush was invented, and they began using it for top hats. It became more and more popular. Early silk hats weren't that great either, because they were made using arsenic, some of them. Not all of them, but especially very, very old silk hats will quite likely have arsenic, so be careful. Now, around the turn of the century, my favorite time of the Gilded Age, it was standard for when you went to the opera that you would wear full fig, white tie, a top hat, white tie, and tails, as Fred Astaire says. And, of course, nowadays, a top hat is not required for a white tie outfit, but it used to be, because everyone would wear hats, and the only hat formal enough to go with a full fig outfit white tie ensemble would be a top hat. But funny enough, back in the Georgian era and the Regency, the bicorn was the hat of evening wear, and the top hat would be a day wear hat. Now, when you would go to the opera, you would have to wear all these things. You would look very debonair. But what to do with your top hat when you sit down in your cramped opera chair? Well, if you wore your top hat, those behind you would not be able to see. They'd not be able to see the opera. So, you would have to take it off and store it perhaps under your seat or in your lap. Now that was not very practical. People did not like doing that very much. So, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the opera hat was invented. Now, an opera hat, to the untrained eye, looks very similar to your standard silk hat. In fact, it's shiny, it has the same shape, it has a brim, it has a flat crown. The top of the crown, though, would not be shiny. It would have a matte finish. But the main thing that'd be different about the opera hat would be that you could collapse it. And then, when you're ready to depart the opera, you would simply give it a flick, or you would pop the bottom, and it would spring right back out. Now, this is not an opera hat. Many top hats, especially, you can usually tell because opera hats are not made of silk plush. They're just sort of your standard satin silk, perhaps what you would find on the lapel of a tuxedo. But to the untrained eye, you might not be able to tell. It's just a shiny fabric. But usually on opera hats, the top, this bit, would not be covered in satin. It would be, as I said, it would have a matte finish. So, if you see a top hat, do not immediately try to crumple it down. You'll damage it. Well, of course, the top hat that I wear, it's at least 120 years old, very likely much older. And these get very dusty, so you would have to clean it using a velvet polishing pad. I don't have a polishing pad, but I have this, like, velvet bag. It works. It has to be velvet. Nothing else will work. Any other material will damage the delicate and, mind you, irreplaceable silk. You can't replace it. It's not made anymore. So, you would take your velvet polishing pad and you just rub it along the nap. Do not go against the nap, it will mess up the silk. Just rub it, get all the dust out. Much better. I just love the way it glistens in the light. Now, I hope this was informative, and I bid you a farewell.